Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
I am going to start with the line my mother left me with at the airport drop-off, because it has been walking around my head like an unwanted roommate ever since she said it, and if you hear it the way I heard it, you will understand why I did what I did later. Since she leaned into the open window, smiled in that purse-lipped way she does when she wants to sound gentle without giving an inch, and said, "You should enjoy the quiet at home. Try to breathe. Try to rest. Maybe use the time to think about your next steps," while my sister in the back seat pretended not to hear, busy sending photos of her passport to friends who were already waiting in Paris with lists of places she just had to see, and in that moment something old and heavy in me moved. Not like anger exactly, more like a door that had been jammed for years finally giving way, because I suddenly heard the sentence as code for what it had always meant in this family, which is we are going to do what we want and you should just make peace with it. I kept the smile, I played along, I told them to have a great trip in text when they landed, and even added a joke about bringing me back a keychain, which bought me their usual laugh that sounds nice and costs nothing. Then I watched the car pull away and felt that familiar sensation of being useful only when they need a ride or a signature or a last-minute favor. And I went home to the house where I still paid my share of the utilities because we had agreed it was temporary and practical. Even though temporary had turned into something more like a lifestyle, with my sister forever on the brink of another big opportunity that required everyone else to shift, and me forever in the role of the reasonable daughter who knows how to be flexible. I have told myself many times that fairness is not a real thing in families, that people fall into positions early and then everyone gets tired and sticks with the old dance because changing steps makes people look at themselves, and nobody wants that. So I usually swallow the irritation, wash my coffee mug, and get on with my day, but this time the way that sentence landed, "enjoy the quiet," made the silence inside the house feel less like rest and more like being shoved into a corner with a pat on the head, which you can only tolerate so many times before you start thinking about the scoreboard you pretend not to keep. I did the grown-up things first, because that is my reflex, paying the internet bill, making a grocery list that assumed I would eat at home more while they were gone, and setting an alarm to water my mother's plants. And while I was collecting the mail stacked on the hall table, I noticed a thin white envelope slid sideways under a flyer. Nothing dramatic, just a bank logo and my mother's name above our address, and without meaning to snoop, I held it. Thought about putting it in her room, then felt that little pull you feel when you know something wants to be seen, so I opened it, not with a flourish, not like a movie, more like a person who is tired of being the last to know about decisions that affect her life. Before I tell you what was inside, I need you to know a few things that set the stage without turning this into a therapy monologue, because context matters here. Years ago, after my father had a surgery that scared us all, we set up a shared account for emergencies and household expenses, and because I was the one with better credit at the time, my name ended up on the paperwork with theirs, which was supposed to be temporary, but then my sister's car died and there were repairs. And then there was a stretch when my mother wanted to redo the kitchen just a little, and somehow the account never got closed. It simply floated there as a family tool everyone talked about like it was air, always around, never really addressed. And I stopped asking about it because it was easier to let it be the thing they used when they needed to fix something while I paid my own bills and tried not to notice that my needs rarely qualified as emergencies. So I am standing in the hallway with this envelope, and I open it, and it is a monthly statement for that very account I thought had faded into the background, and I see my name still there, printed as neatly as a warning no one heard. And I skim the transactions, and that is when my face got hot in a way I could feel even without a mirror, because there are transfers labeled things like travel deposit and gift hold and card payoff, which on their own could be anything, but together form a pattern even a half-asleep person could recognize, a pattern that says the account has been doing a lot of heavy lifting for a woman who currently has a boarding pass and a list of rooftop bars to try, while the other woman, the one who waters the plants and takes out the trash and is told to enjoy the quiet, is expected to treat the whole thing like a family bonding exercise. I know how this sounds, like I am building a case with receipts and emotion, and maybe I am, because when you live long enough as the responsible one, you collect facts the way other people collect souvenirs, and you keep them in a drawer you rarely open. But when you do, the shape of your life becomes very clear, and in that hallway it did, because the balance on that account was not small, and the withdrawals lined up with moments I could match to conversations where I had been told, gently and firmly, that times were tight, that everyone needed to pull together, that maybe I could wait a bit on the thing I needed since my sister had a chance to do something important right now, and we all had to support that. I did not cry, I did not scream, and I did not call anyone, which for me is progress. Instead, I took the statement to the kitchen table and laid it out flat. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to imagine what would happen if I stopped being the dependable background character in my family's movie and became the person who writes her own plot, not with fireworks, not with cruelty, but with the kind of cold, organized clarity that makes people wonder when exactly the shift started, because they did not see it happening. They were too busy having a great time, and I will be honest, there was a moment there where I laughed. Not because any of it was funny, but because the line "enjoy the quiet" suddenly felt like an invitation to do exactly that, only not in the way they meant. I will tell you the precise moment the idea formed, and it was not a dramatic thunderclap, more like a click in the mind, the way a door lock turns when you finally try the right key, since I realized that the account was not a secret chest they owned and I envied. It was a legal thing with my name on it that had been used as a siphon for years while I kept telling myself family comes first, and once that truth sat down and made itself comfortable, I could finally look at it without guilt, and I could ask a very simple question I had avoided for a long time, which is, if the rules are always flexible when they need something, why am I the only one who treats them like stone when I need something? And what would happen if I decided to play by their version of the rules for once? I folded the statement along its creases, slid it back into the envelope, and put it in my bag, not because I was hiding anything but because I was done leaving important things on the hall table for other people to manage. Then I opened my laptop and logged into an online portal I had not visited in years, and when the page loaded and I saw the account details pop up and my name sitting there as calmly as a lighthouse you somehow forgot was yours, I felt that lock click again. And I knew with the kind of certainty that does not shout, that this story was about to change direction, and that quiet was going to sound very different when they came home. When I tell you I sat down with that login page and felt like I was about to open a door that everyone had walked through except me, I am not being dramatic. I am just describing that practical kind of dread you get before you look at something you already suspect will confirm what you have been pretending not to know. So when the dashboard loaded and the numbers settled into place and the recent activity populated line by line, I did not gasp or clutch my chest. I just let the pattern speak. Because it always does when you stop making excuses for it, and the pattern here was painfully simple. Deposits from my paychecks years ago back when we agreed we would all contribute for emergencies and repairs, still visible in the history. Followed by the slow, steady stream of transfers out labeled in neutral language that hides intentions, travel deposit, balance assist, caregiver reimbursement, and then the larger, bolder moves, a wire to a card payoff that matched the exact month my sister posted a thank you to our parents for helping her get back to zero, which I liked at the time because that is what you do when you are the reasonable one. You clap for other people's relief, and you tell yourself your turn will come if you keep being patient and useful. What I had not realized until I saw it in black and white was that my patience had been the glue holding together a very comfortable arrangement for everyone but me. Because if the account existed as a quiet safety net for the family, and I was part of the family on paper but not in practice, then I had been underwriting a lifestyle I never chose, and it turned out the math of that felt far worse than the emotion. Since I could measure it in months of rent I struggled through, in student loan payments I made while we could not spare anything because we were saving for something that always looked suspiciously like my sister's next big push. I clicked into the settings because that is where control usually hides, and sure enough my contact information was there, old phone number, old email, the kind of oversight that sets the stage for plausible deniability. We tried to reach you. We assumed you saw the alerts, Why did you not say anything? And I updated it all without ceremony. New number, current email, no theatrics, just the quiet satisfaction of finally putting my hand on the steering wheel of the car I had been asked to push from behind for years, and then I turned on every alert the bank offered: low balance, debit card charges, wire initiations, external transfers, paper statements, paperless statements, all of it. Because if we were going to keep calling this a shared account, then it could start behaving like one that actually respected the fact that my name was not decorative. The next thing I did was pull the last 2 years of statements into a single file, not to build a courtroom case, but to build my own backbone. Because there is something clarifying about scrolling month by month and seeing how many times I said yes to being reasonable while other people translated that yes into dinners, flights, new furniture, and fee waivers negotiated with a friendly banker who, by the way, still had me listed as a primary, which told me everything I needed to know about the legal reality that sat under the family story. Because if I was a primary, then I was not an accessory. I was an owner, which in plain terms meant I was allowed to do what owners do without asking for permission from people who never asked me. I remembered a conversation from a winter when I could not afford new tires, and my father said we had to be careful with the account because it was strictly for emergencies. While in the same week my sister's weekend trip became an unexpected work opportunity, which I was told was urgent and rare and not to be missed, and I nodded because I am good at being supportive. And right there at the kitchen table, that memory finally sat in the right place, not as a sad little anecdote but as a data point that made a decision feel less like revenge and more like alignment, like bringing the facts of the situation into agreement with the story I would accept about my own life. I did one small thing that might sound petty if you have never been starved of basic fairness, but if you have, you will understand exactly why it felt like oxygen, because I changed the mailing address for the account to my apartment mailbox, which meant future statements would come to me by default, and if that burned later, well, fire is honest, but more importantly it meant I was done being the person who learned about decisions after they were made, and while I was in the settings I added a 2-step verification tied to my phone, which is exactly the sort of boring administrative step that alters the power dynamics in a way nobody sees until the day they try to do something without you and run into a wall that says, "Please enter the code." Before I closed the laptop, I looked at the current balance and did that mental math you do when you have lived on lists and trade-offs. Here was enough to clear the last of my student loans that had hung around like a bad relationship. Enough to pay for a deposit and several months of rent on a place that was mine without anyone's size or conditions. Enough to give me the kind of runway my sister had been handed every time she changed careers and called it growth, and I will not pretend I did not feel a physical wave of anger at the wasted years, but it was not the wild kind that makes you reckless. It was the clean kind that makes you careful, and it left behind a simple rule for what would happen next, which was that I would take only steps I could explain to myself without shame, steps that followed the actual rules of the account and the actual reality of my role, and I would document every move so that when the inevitable calls and messages came, I would not be tempted to apologize just to make the noise stop. To test the water without announcing anything, I requested a reissue of the debit card associated with my name, which had expired and never been replaced because I told myself I did not need it, and I set spending alerts to ping me in real time so that, for the first time in forever, transactions on the account would land on my phone within seconds, not as gossip later at the dinner table, and I also paused one automatic transfer that moved a small amount every week to an external card ending in numbers I recognized as my sister's, because I knew that particular drip would not be noticed for at least a little while. Given that Paris would be covering her with distractions and my parents would be busy taking pictures and pretending the past did not exist, and that pause, tiny and almost invisible, became the first brick in the path I was laying out for myself. A path that did not ask for permission and did not offer a heads up to people who had never extended me the same courtesy. I was not finished, not even close, but I closed the laptop and sat there with the quiet they had told me to enjoy, and I found that for once it actually felt good, not empty and not punishing, just honest. because I had finally stepped into the center of a situation that had shaped my life for years, and as I put the card reissue confirmation email in a folder and set a reminder to check the mail midweek, my phone buzzed with a message from an international number I did not have saved, a photo of my sister under a blue awning with a caption that read, "Wait until you see the surprise Mom and Dad are planning for when we get back. You will lose your mind," which made me smile in a way that would have worried them if they had seen it, because I knew, as surely as I knew my own name on that account, that the surprise would not be the one they imagined. The message about a surprise waiting for me when they got back sat in my notifications like a dare, so I did what I always do when I need to pull myself out of the spin, which is make a plan that is so clear it can survive pushback. And I started with actions that looked almost boring from the outside, small enough to pass under any lazy radar, but precise enough to tell me exactly how closely anyone was watching, because I had learned that the fastest way to see the truth in a family like mine is to touch the thing everyone thinks you will never touch and see who notices. So the first move was a modest transfer from the shared account to my personal checking that would cover nothing more dramatic than a couple of bills and the tail end of a loan payment. And I watched the alert hit my phone, and then I waited, not tensely, not with paranoia, just attentive, the way you watch a pot when you actually want it to boil, and the hours went by with nothing but a few more vacation photos in the group chat and a motherly reminder to keep the front porch light on at night, which I did because I am petty in some ways, but not in that one. The next step was a conversation with the bank that I kept deliberately dry and polite, the kind where you repeat back the agent's name and thank them for their time because you want the call recorded as a model of calm. And I asked for a confirmation of my status on the account, which they read back as primary with full transaction rights and card privileges, and I asked for a note to be placed that any account changes would require confirmation to my number. And I requested a fresh statement to be mailed and emailed, and I asked the agent to explain how alerts worked if multiple names were on an account, and when he told me that alerts go to whoever is enrolled and that currently only my old email was enrolled, I took a breath I did not realize I had been holding for years, and I enrolled my current contact information while he waited, which meant that from that minute forward I was no longer in the category of person who finds out after the fact. And that shift felt less like defiance and more like administration, which is exactly how I wanted this to look to anyone who tried to read it later. I tested the reissued card with a small grocery run and then a utility payment, each one pinging my phone properly, and when nothing else pinged me from the other side, I knew with a certainty that did not need drama that they were either not watching or were content with what they believed was a stable setup, which was funny in a dry, unfunny way, because stability is always easy when someone else is carrying the weight. And with that confirmation, I started a series of measured withdrawals, spaced out and sized to match the kind of irregular expenses families pretend come out of nowhere, and I kept a spreadsheet that would embarrass me in any other context, but here felt like a form of self-respect, with columns for date, purpose, category, and a note to future me about why this mattered so that when guilt tried to creep in dressed as good manners, I could show it the ledger and tell it to go bother someone else. During that first week of their trip, which rolled by in a blur of my sister sending shots of croissants and my parents approving heart reactions like they were managing a brand campaign, I paid off the final piece of my student loan, not with a victory dance, not with a post, but with a quiet confirmation screen and a reminder email filed under a folder labeled closure, and I will not pretend that did not make my chest feel lighter in a way I had not felt since my early 20s, because every month that bill had been a knot tied by choices I made while the family told me to be responsible so we could all move forward, and it turns out forward had always meant her forward, never mine. And seeing that balance hit zero felt like cutting a cord nobody else even knew was around my ankle. I also signed a lease on a small apartment that fit me without negotiation, paid the deposit and several months ahead so that moving out would not be a beggar's parade with borrowed boxes and shame, and I scheduled the move for the weekend before their return, which meant I could clear my things in the daylight without commentary and leave the house exactly as I found it, minus the items that had always been mine and the pieces I had purchased outright, and I took photos of rooms and receipts. and serial numbers, not because I plan to argue, but because I plan not to, and documentation keeps you from being dragged into bad faith debates, and I was done playing that game where I made their feelings more important than my facts. Part of me wanted to send a message to my mother saying I hoped Paris was everything she wanted it to be, and that I was busy at home taking care of my life, which would have been the first honest sentence we had exchanged in a long time, but I let the impulse pass. Because I had finally understood that control lives in silence more than in speeches, and the more I wrote or explained, the more raw material I would hand them later when they wanted to make this about tone or respect or any of the other words people use when they do not want to talk about money. And if this was going to be judged by anything, it would be judged by the rules they taught me to respect, the ones on paper with my name on them. Late in the week, while I was labeling boxes and checking off tasks on a checklist that would make an operations manager proud, a familiar alert chimed on my phone, only this time it was not mine. It was a pending external transfer initiated from the shared account to my sister's card for an amount that would cover a few luxury purchases and a round of celebratory meals when they got back. And, because of the security I had put in place, the transfer required confirmation to my number before it could go through, and there it was, the quiet proof that I now held the key to a door they assumed was always open, and I stared at the screen for a long second, and then I hit decline, clean and simple, which triggered a failure notice that would land somewhere they were not checking, and I sat there feeling neither glee nor guilt, just a kind of even fairness, because if the rule was that shared money could be moved without asking me, then the new rule was that it could be paused without asking them. And as I set the phone down, another message arrived from my sister, a selfie with a caption about a surprise upgrade they had planned for her room, and without thinking I typed back a single line that made me smile in a way I could not completely control. A line I had earned the right to use, and then I deleted it before hitting send, because the better line was the one I would say later, when they were standing in the doorway and finally listening. I woke up the morning of my move with a list that would look obsessive to anyone who has never had to organize their way out of a trap, and I went through it line by line because calm lives in action, not pep talks. So I started by confirming the lease payment that I had set to clear from the shared account into my savings, and then into the new landlord's portal, which meant there would be no gap where someone could accuse me of running off in chaos. And after that I called the utility companies and removed my name from every service tied to the house, not with spite, just with the kind of finality that makes it impossible for anyone to pretend I am still responsible for a place that has never really been mine except when there were chores or bills. And when the agent asked for a forwarding address, I gave it without hesitation, because I was done acting like a ghost who lived in their story. The movers arrived right on time, a pair of guys who did not ask unnecessary questions and did not try to talk to me about the weather, and I was grateful for that, because I needed the silence for the next step, which was the one that would move this whole thing from symbolic to real. So while they lifted the furniture I had bought and packed the kitchen tools that had my receipts and collected the electronics that lived on my accounts, I opened the bank portal and pulled up the document I had built over the past week, a simple ledger of my deposits into the shared account, the emergencies it had covered that were actually mine, the many it had covered that were not, and the difference that had been treated as an invisible tax for the privilege of being the dependable daughter, and I let that number sit in front of me until I felt steady. Then I set a transfer that brought the balance in my direction. Not as a smash and grab, not as some dramatic zero, but as a careful extraction. That matched my recorded share with a cushion for the years I had been told to wait, which I will admit felt like I was finally signing my own permission slip after a lifetime of asking for one. I left a practical amount in the account, enough to keep the lights on metaphorically, enough to make it clear I was not trying to burn anything down, and enough that any alert would not scream emergency before they landed. And then I changed the online password one more time, saved the confirmation in a secure file with a timestamp, and tested the two-step confirmation to make sure no one could casually authorize a transfer from under my nose. And while I was at it, I removed old devices from the access list the way you clear out a junk drawer, one by one, no commentary, because a boundary is not a speech, it is a set of settings you enforce. I did one more thing that might seem small from the outside, but mattered more than the money to me, which was canceling the auto transfer that had been feeding my sister's card every week like a pet that nobody admitted existed. And I set the system to send a notice to my email for any new payees, which meant that if they wanted to rebuild their drip, they would have to face the message that told them they could not set it up without me, and that was not about making their life hard, that was about making the relationship honest, and I have learned those are not the same thing no matter how loudly people insist they are. Once my things were in the truck, I did a slow walk through each room, not with nostalgia, because there is no nostalgia for a place that held you in place while other people ran in circles, but with a practical eye for anything that might later become a fight. And I took photos of the emptiness I was leaving, the clean counters where my appliances had been, the empty shelf where I had kept my books, the outlets where my cords had lived, because I wanted the record to show that I took myself and my contributions, and I did not take anything else, not a lamp that was not mine, not a dish that had sentimental value to anyone but me, not a single thing that could be spun into theft when what really happened here was closure. I left the spare key on the kitchen table, and next to it, instead of a note that would invite edits and rewrites and pitches for sympathy, I left a copy of the first page of the bank statement with the names at the top and the date circled and nothing else. Because I wanted the first thing they held to be the reality I had been asked to ignore, and because there is nothing to argue with in a line of type that says you are an owner, and there is nothing to reinterpret in a balance that shrank. Because the person you told to enjoy the quiet finally decided to do exactly that on her own terms. On my way out, I stopped by the router I had bought and paid for and reset it to factory and tucked it into a box. Since I was done being the person who kept the internet running and the printer connected and the streaming passwords current while being told that I should be grateful for the roof I helped pay to maintain. And I turned off the porch light because utilities were no longer my job, and I locked the door without ceremony, which is the only way to do it if you do not want to turn yourself into a performance. At the new apartment, I signed for the keys, moved in the boxes the movers stacked like they had been there 100 times, and I sat on the floor with my phone in my hand and watched the last transfer clear, the one that moved the cushion I had earned from the shared account into my own, and at that exact minute my screen lit up with a text from my mother's number that said, "Wheels down in a few hours. Can you make sure the house is ready for our little surprise?" And I stared at that sentence for a long breath, long enough to taste the decision I had already made, and I typed a reply that was only 3 words, simple and unadorned. Then I did not send it, because the better way was to let them open the door first and let the quiet do its job. And if you have ever been forced to swallow your voice, you know exactly why that felt right, so I set the phone face down on the floor, listened to the apartment settle around me, and waited for the moment when their keys would hit a lock that no longer led to me. They walked into the house expecting some cute reveal that would crown my sister's month abroad with another round of applause, and instead they found rooms that sounded like truth, because there is a particular kind of quiet that follows years of polite lying. And that is what met them first: bare walls where my shelves had been, clean counters where my appliances had rested, and a single sheet of paper on the kitchen table that did not scold or explain or beg, just a bank header with 3 names and a date that said more clearly than I ever could that nothing had happened here by accident, and I let that sink in for them without commentary, because I had learned that commentary is where they always hid. So when the calls started, back to back, name flashing, then his, then hers again from the international number rolling over to domestic, I watched the screen light up and die down and light up again, and I did nothing, not out of cruelty, but because for once I wanted them to sit inside the exact feeling I had been handed for years, the feeling of being left to make sense of a decision you were never invited into. Eventually I answered, not to perform a debate, not to defend a thesis, but to say the only complete sentence that fit the moment, and I said, "Enjoy the quiet," and I let the silence hang there long enough for them to hear the echo of their own words. And then I told them calmly that if they wanted to talk, we would talk at the bank the next afternoon with an account manager present, because I was done having conversations that turn into memory puzzles later, and my mother sputtered something about betrayal, and my father tried the disappointed voice that used to work on me when I was young and afraid of losing approval, and I did not raise my voice or weep or fill the gaps. I just repeated the time and the branch and said I would only discuss shared money in a place where the rules are printed on paper and everyone has to look at them. That night I slept in my new apartment on a mattress that was mine and a floor that did not creak with anyone's judgment, and in the morning I printed the ledger I had built, not to shove in their faces, but to keep myself anchored. Because you cannot argue with a column that shows where your deposits landed and who benefited from them, and I walked into the branch a few minutes early and told the manager exactly what was happening. That a family account with multiple primaries had been used for years in a way that treated one of the primaries like a ghost, and that I had exercised the same rights everyone else had been using, and that I wanted the account either dissolved or converted to a structure that required dual authorization for any transfer. Not because I was plotting to control them, but because I was finished being the only person who lived by rules while everyone else lived by feelings. They arrived together, flushed from outrage and rehearsed indignation, and my sister started in with a speech about how I had humiliated them and ruined her homecoming, which told me everything I needed to know about who the real audience had always been. And I let her finish, because interruptions would only become the point later. Then I slid the ledger across the table to my parents and asked the manager to read the rights attached to my name on the account, and he did, in the steady tone of a person who has seen this exact scene 100 times, and when my mother said the word theft, he did not even look at me. He just pointed to the account agreement and the signatures and explained that primary means primary, and that if there were concerns about fairness, those concerns belonged to the family, not the bank, and the room went very still in that way that happens when the performance has nowhere left to go. I told them I had moved out, that my belongings were mine and were gone, that utilities bearing my name had been closed or transferred properly, that I had left a practical balance in the account so that no auto payments would bounce, and that I would be removing myself from the account entirely once our meeting concluded, because I was no longer willing to be the structural support for a system that treated me like a temporary guest until there was a bill. And when my father threatened lawyers, I said he was free to make whatever phone calls helped him process, and that I would happily hand over the same ledger to anyone he hired, along with a list of the withdrawals over the years that lined up with my sister's lifestyle pivots and celebratory posts, and that if he wanted to discuss the word theft we could include those too. He deflated first, which surprised me, because he is usually the last to drop the script, and my mother shifted into the softer angle, the one where she asks if we can fix this as a family, and I said we could. And that fixing meant admitting the shape of the past, not smearing it into a misunderstanding, and that the fix started today with the account being locked to any single person's whim. And with me walking away holding only what I had paid in plus the cushion I should have had all along. And that if anyone wanted to rebuild something with me, it would have to be based on requests instead of assumptions, and on yes that do not arrive pre-printed with guilt. My sister called me cruel and calculated and accused me of timing this to hurt her, and I told her the truth she hates most, which is that nothing I did was about her, that for once I had made a decision that did not orbit her needs, and that the date and the keys and the silence were chosen for me, to restore a balance I should never have lost, and that if she wanted to be angry she could be angry at the years when every emergency was hers and every economy was mine. And then I stood, thanked the manager, signed the paperwork that converted the account to dual authorization for my parents, and signed the form that removed me from it, effective immediately. And I handed over the spare key in an envelope addressed to my mother, because I was finished with the theater of kitchen tables. In the parking lot, my phone buzzed with a message from my father that was almost gentle, asking if we could talk later without all the formalities, and I let it sit. Then I typed a short reply that said I hoped they enjoyed the quiet and that when they were ready to speak without rewriting what happened, they could reach me, and I put the phone away, walked to my car, and sat for a minute with the ordinary relief of a person who has finally stopped negotiating with her own boundaries, and I will tell you the part one did not say in the branch, the one last piece that I kept for when someone tries something stupid, which is that I have a full copy of the account history and my notes packaged with a calm little letter I will send to certain relatives if I ever hear that I stole what was never mine, not to shame anyone, just to end the gossip with the only thing that cuts through it, which is the truth lined up in order. People will say I went too far, because they always do when a quiet person stops being convenient, and they will ask why I did not try another family meeting or send another long message asking to be seen, and I will not convince them, which is fine. Because I did not do this for the crowd or for vindication online. I did it so I could live in a place where my rent is paid by my decisions and my phone stays silent when it should, and if there is anything left to say, it is only this. I did not flip the table. I just stopped setting it, and when they came home to an empty house and an account that finally reflected the reality they had written for years, they met the only version of me that has ever been sustainable. The one who chooses quiet on her own terms and leaves the door open only to people who know how to knock.